You know, Ron Kurtz never set out originally to develop a psychotherapy method. He began working with people without really having the credentials, and there's a wonderful chapter about this at the end of his first book on Hakomi. Well, not the first book, the body-centered psychotherapy, the Hakomi Method. It followed The Body Reveals. And later, he gradually saw that the method evolved from some techniques that he was fascinated with in the 70s and early 80s. He had attended yoga classes, and he got inspired to use mindfulness and little experiments in mindfulness to help somebody make a discovery about how they're organizing experience. So probes, for example, using a statement that the person would hear in mindfulness to discover how they related to the idea in the statement. That was one of the first techniques. Gradually, he began to see that the techniques were part of a method, a larger method. And the method was experiments in mindfulness for self-discovery. And eventually, after working with many people, especially in groups, in teaching situations, he realized that the method was only as good as the relationship between the therapist and client. That everything that happened that was effective or successful depended on this relationship or alliance that the therapist and client had. And the method is one that works really well as a collaboration between therapist and client. So the focus shifted there to how do we cultivate the kind of relationship? How do we use skills like contact statements, we'll talk about later, to develop the relationship with the client that's going to allow the process to unfold. And then eventually he began to realize that this relationship that the therapist has with the client depends totally on the therapist's state of mind, the client too. But what we as therapists or practitioners can control is our own state of mind. So as Ron began to focus more attention on the state of mind that the therapist is in, the client's state of mind also, but our own state of mind, he developed the idea of what he began to call the practice of loving presence. That the therapist's state of mind, when it is a loving and present state of mind, actually generates the opportunity and the context for healing better than any other state of mind. And there's a story that I've told about Ron realizing in a demo session with a client that he had just spontaneously dropped into this way of being nourished by the client without any need to understand or follow the story. And the more nourished he felt by just simply being with the client, the more the client deepened, and it became a feedback loop, a reciprocal process. And he began to discover that there's a way to develop this state of mind, to cultivate this state of mind. And he developed the 4 stages that lead to the loving presence state of mind. We call this the practice of loving presence, and I'll talk more about those stages in a moment. But the focus of the whole training shifted to how to cultivate this state of mind as the foundation for everything else. That the method and even the relationship between therapist and client is based on this state of mind we call the practice of loving presence. As the trainings began to feel based on and use as a foundation this practice of loving presence, more and more the method of psychotherapy that was called Hakomi by that time became clear that it was a method of assisted self-discovery, that there's a very distinguishing characteristic about working with Hakomi and in a Hakomi way with somebody, which is that we're really assisting them using mindfulness to make a discovery about how they're organizing experience based on habits and beliefs in ways that may be actually causing them suffering or stress. And so the whole focus shifted more and more from any kind of traditional psychotherapy to what we ultimately called mindfulness-based assisted self-discovery. And as this focus developed and became the prime focus, Ron began to include elements of Buddhism, for example. Taoism had already influenced him a lot, but the whole idea from Buddhism of alleviating unnecessary suffering became an unspoken part of how we teach Hakomi and how we practice it with a client. Eventually, Ron actually named his trainings Psychotherapy as Spiritual Practice. And the first training that I was a teacher on with Ron was called Higher Ground, Hakomi as Spiritual Practice. When Ron Kurtz began practicing and then teaching psychotherapy, he gathered around him some people who were fascinated with the way he was working because they could see that it was unique and different in some way. And in those days, that group of people called it Kurtz work. And I always say that in some kind of moment, unusual moment of self-consciousness or unself-consciousness, Ron decided that he didn't want it called Kurtz work. He wanted another name for the method. At which point, one of the people came to him one day having had a dream that he, Ron, had handed this fellow a piece of paper, and on it was written the word Hakomi, H-A-K-O-M-I. None of them knew what the word meant, so they began to research it. They thought it sounded Japanese, but they researched the name and they found that the word Hakomi occurs in the Hopi tradition. In the Hopi language, Hakomi, the archaic translation of the word, is how do you stand in relation to these many realms? Essentially, it's a question that says, who are you? Or sometimes I like to describe it as, who is it that you think you are? And it fit perfectly with this method as it began to evolve into very clearly a method of assisted self-discovery, helping people discover who they're creating as their self-image, what kind of world are they creating as a model of where they live and what kind of reality they live in. And ultimately, if that's who I am and this is the world I live in, how do I need to behave in order to get my needs met? And that was the word Hakomi. Who are you? How do you stand in relation to these many realms? In the very early days, as Ron Kurtz was developing this method that ultimately became called Hakomi, he was very influenced from having attended some yoga classes. That I appreciated because I had been a yoga teacher long before I met Ron. And one of the things that we had in common was the understanding that we can cultivate a state of mind called mindfulness, and even a few moments of mindfulness, to become aware of something that's happening in present time. Right from the beginning, Ron was using mindfulness and little experiments in mindfulness as a way of assisting people to change their reactions to life, first of all, by becoming conscious of them. Instead of blaming life for the experiences they were having, helping people to realize that there's a way that each of us organizes our experience and that our reactions are clues about the beliefs we have and the experiences we've had and the behaviors we have that contribute to the kind of experiences we're having. So mindfulness was constant throughout the evolution of the method. And ultimately, coming back to the importance of this practice of mindfulness, grounded in the practice of loving presence, it became very clear to Ron that the whole business, the whole process with a client, the whole practice and way of being that we call Hakomi is a spiritual practice. When we think about psychotherapy in general, or Hakomi in particular, as a spiritual practice, we're thinking about two aspects of the work. Certainly one is the development of our state of mind as therapists or practitioners. How are we being with another person that sets the context for a healing experience? And there's a shift in this way of working away from feeling like the therapist is fixing or even helping the client to change their life. The focus is a lot on appreciating the client for exactly who they are, and of being honored and blessed really in the privilege of being present with somebody as they go on this journey. And the journey, grounded in mindfulness, has a trust and a belief that everything's all right. I remember Ron talking about reading somewhere, and I don't know where, about the 3 characteristics of a master therapist. And one of them, I will tell you the others later, one of them is that there's no real problem in the mind of a master therapist. This belief in the perfection of everything as it is, and the willingness to sit with somebody and assist them in a journey, is definitely a spiritual practice. Another aspect of psychotherapy, or Hakomi in particular, as a spiritual practice, is the realization that we're not so much assisting clients with a particular problem or to change something in particular about their relationships or their life. We're actually assisting each other in a way of being in the world, in a way of being in life. It's not a problem-oriented process. It's a way of developing and cultivating the possibility of being more conscious in every moment in our life, and more willing to engage and embrace even everything that happens. This becomes not just a spiritual practice for the therapist, but a way of, without any hint of religion, and it doesn't matter whether the client is religious or not, the practice is of engaging with life with more trust, more openness, more willingness to embrace mystery. And that becomes a daily, moment-to-moment, mindfulness-based spiritual practice. Developing a habit, not just as a therapist, as a Hakomi practitioner, but as a person in life, developing a habit of paying attention in this mindful way to present experience just as it is, without needing to manipulate it or change it. This is a very empowering and powerful way of moving through life. It's amazing for a therapist to be willing to sit in presence, in loving presence, not just with the client, but with the moment, with the experience that's happening. And without knowing where it's going or needing to control the outcome, be willing to participate with somebody and collaborate with them on this journey of consciousness. We call it a spiritual practice because the focus is not so much on problem solving or on fixing, or it's not at all on that. It's on embracing life as it is and collaborating with it in a very creative way. So it's beyond practical. And this makes it what we think of as a spiritual practice and takes us to what Ron liked to call higher ground. Having worked with so many people in this Hakomi way, not just in trainings and groups, but one-to-one with people, I became really clear after many years that the main benefit that the client or the student goes away with after experiencing a Hakomi relationship, let's say, whether it's one-to-one or in group, the main benefit they go away with is more potential for using mindful awareness and self-awareness in a very simple way. Not long periods of meditation necessarily, but just moments of catching oneself in the middle of a reaction. And in that gap, the opportunity to make a choice about what we call a response instead of a reaction. So this habit that we cultivate of noticing what's happening and noticing how we're participating in what's happening gives us choice. And the choice becomes a creative response to life that allows for transformation of our experiences. One of the ways that I think of Hakomi as a spiritual practice is that I'm continually reminding myself and being reminded to trust that I'm a participant in the whole experience of life, in my life, and I'm a participant in the journey that a client is having with me, that we're collaborating. So I'm not, as the therapist, making anything happen. As soon as I sit in a place of feeling I need to control the outcome, or I know what needs to happen, or I know how to solve the problem, I've lost the whole spirit of Hakomi. I want, as the practitioner, as a therapist, to sit in the place of being honored, being nourished, and being a very creative participant in the unfolding without needing to know where it's going or why it's going where it's going. So how can I learn to be present in that way with that kind of trust and not try to manipulate the outcome? And there's something about that model that I can give to a client that allows them to go back into their life and participate and engage and not need to be in control when it's not possible to control life, but be able to meet life exactly as it comes. And this becomes the way of being as a therapist. It becomes a way of doing the process of Hakomi with a client, of teaching the method to a group, not knowing how it's unfolding or where it's unfolding or where it's going to, not even needing to control the moment-to-moment way that it unfolds, but meeting and engaging really actively and creatively with that, with ultimate trust that it's what wants to happen. That's the wonderful Hakomi phrase that I use frequently and that we love, is what wants to happen here? Not what do I want to make happen? What does the client want to have happen? What wants to happen? What is the unfolding that is the healing that is happening now?